I was 66 years old the day I realized my entire marriage had been a performance, and the man who made me feel alive again was about to cost me everything I'd spent 4 decades building. My name is Margaret, and for 42 years I woke up next to a man who treated me like furniture. Richard wasn't cruel, he wasn't violent, he was just absent. We lived in our house in Riverside, Connecticut, like two strangers sharing a lease, separate bedrooms for the last 15 years. Polite nods over breakfast. His golf, my book club. Our daughter Lisa called every Sunday, and we'd both get on the phone and pretend we were still the couple from her childhood photos. I told myself this was just what marriage became, that everyone our age was living the same quiet lie. Then I met Daniel at the community center. He was 68, recently widowed, teaching a watercolor class I'd signed up for on a Tuesday afternoon when the silence in my house felt like it was crushing my chest. I remember walking into that bright room with the smell of paint and turpentine, and he looked up from arranging brushes and smiled at me like I was the first person he'd seen all day. Not a polite smile, a real one. "You're new," he said, and something in my stomach flipped in a way I hadn't felt since I was a teenager. If you're watching this, stay with me, because what happened next changed everything. And I'm still trying to understand if I'm a monster or just a woman who'd been buried alive for too long. The first few weeks were innocent. We painted. We talked about colors and light and shadow. He told me about his wife Sarah, how he'd cared for her through 2 years of cancer, how the house still smelled like her perfume and he couldn't bring himself to wash her pillowcases. I told him about the affair Richard had in 1998 that I pretended not to know about how somewhere along the way we'd both just given up. Daniel listened like my words mattered. After the 4th class, he asked if I wanted to get coffee. I said yes before my brain could list all the reasons I shouldn't. We sat in a small cafe on Brookside Avenue for 3 hours. He asked me what I'd wanted to be before I became Richard's wife. I couldn't remember anyone asking me that in decades. I told him I'd wanted to write, that I had notebooks full of half-finished stories in a box in the attic that Richard had never asked to read. "Show them to me," Daniel said, and the way he looked at me made me feel like I was disappearing and coming into focus at the same time. I drove home that day and Richard was watching golf. He didn't ask where I'd been, I didn't tell him, and that's when it started, the life I didn't know I'd been waiting for. If you think you know where this is going, subscribe now, because it gets so much worse than you're imagining. Daniel and I started meeting twice a week, then 3 times, then almost every day. We'd walk through the nature preserve behind the old church, talking about everything we'd buried under years of routine and disappointment. He held my hand once just for a moment when we were crossing a stream on stepping stones, and I felt electricity run through my entire body. I was 66 years old and I felt like I was waking up from a coma. We never kissed. We never crossed that line. But emotionally, I was already gone. I thought about Daniel constantly. I started dressing differently, wearing perfume again. I rewrote one of my old stories and showed it to him in the park, and when he told me it was beautiful, I cried right there on the bench. Richard noticed I was happier. He asked me once if I'd joined a new book club. I said yes. He went back to his crossword puzzle. The guilt was there, sitting in my chest like a stone, but it was buried under something bigger. The feeling that I was finally, after all these years, actually living. Then one afternoon in November, Daniel and I were sitting in his car in the parking lot of the nature preserve because it had started raining. We'd been talking about regret, about the things we'd sacrificed because we thought we were supposed to. And he looked at me and said, "Margaret, I'm falling in love with you." The air left my lungs. The rain hammered on the roof. And I knew right then that I was standing at the edge of a cliff. I should have said no. I should have walked away. But instead, I whispered, "I think I've already fallen. Stay with me. I need you to understand what came next." He kissed me. It was soft and desperate, and it felt like every year I'd spent performing my marriage was burning away. We sat there in that fogged-up car for an hour, holding each other, and I felt more alive than I had in 4 decades. When I got home that night, Richard was asleep in his recliner with the TV still on. I stood in the doorway and looked at him, this man I'd shared my entire adult life with, and I felt nothing. That's when I knew I was in real trouble. Daniel and I met the next day, and the day after that. We talked about running away together, starting over somewhere warm where no one knew us. Arizona, maybe. Or New Mexico. He said he'd been keeping his wife's life insurance money in a separate account, that it was enough for both of us to start fresh. I told him I'd think about it, but I was already planning, already imagining. I started pulling together documents. My passport, bank statements. I opened a separate account Richard didn't know about and started transferring small amounts every week. I told him I was spending it on new clothes, on treating myself. He barely looked up. The thing about living a double life is that it gives you this dangerous sense of power. Like you're smarter than everyone else. Like you figured out something they're all too afraid to reach for. I was so sure I was in control. Then Lisa called on a Thursday in early December. She was coming home for Christmas early this year, she said. Bringing her husband and the kids. Wanted to spend more time with me and Dad because we weren't getting any younger. My blood went cold. 3 weeks with my family in the house. Watching me. Noticing everything. I told Daniel we needed to slow down. He didn't understand. We argued for the first time, sitting in his living room that still had photos of Sarah on every wall. He said he couldn't go back to being alone. That I'd given him a reason to keep living. I left his house feeling like I was being torn in half. And then 2 days later, something happened that made everything implode. Richard came home early from golf. I was in the kitchen looking at flights to Santa Fe on my laptop. I didn't hear him come in. He walked up behind me and said, "Planning a trip?" I closed the laptop so fast I nearly broke it. "Just browsing," I said. He looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen in years. Something sharp, something awake. "You've been different lately," he said. "Happy." The way he said happy made it sound like an accusation. I told him I'd just been feeling better, taking care of myself. He nodded slowly and walked away, and I absolutely knew, that he suspected something. Hit that subscribe button if you're still with me because what happened in the next 48 hours destroyed everything. I called Daniel in a panic, told him Richard was suspicious. He said we should just tell the truth, get it over with. I said no, not yet, not with Lisa coming home. He got angry. Said I was ashamed of him. Of us. I told him that wasn't true, but my voice shook when I said it. We didn't talk for 3 days. It was the longest 3 days of my life. I felt like I was suffocating. Then Richard did something he hadn't done in 15 years. He asked me to go to dinner with him, just the two of us. A nice place in Stamford he'd read about. I said yes because what else could I do? We sat across from each other at a white tablecloth restaurant, and he ordered wine and made small talk about Lisa's visit and the new neighbors and his golf handicap. Normal, surface-level conversation. But I could feel something building underneath, like pressure before an earthquake. Finally, over dessert, he set down his fork and looked at me. Really looked at me. "I know," he said. 2 words. That's all it took for my entire world to crack apart. "Know what?" I whispered. "That you're seeing someone." The restaurant kept moving around us, people laughing, forks clinking. And I was frozen, unable to breathe. "Richard, don't." He held up his hand. "I don't want to know details. I don't want to know his name. I just need to know one thing." He leaned forward. "Are you leaving me?" I opened my mouth. Nothing came out. Because I didn't know the answer. He nodded like I'd confirmed something. I thought so. He pulled out his wallet, dropped cash on the table, and stood up. "We'll talk about this after Lisa leaves. We'll keep it civil through Christmas. For her sake." He walked out of the restaurant and I sat there alone, shaking, while the waiter asked if I wanted more coffee. Comment below if you've ever felt trapped between 2 versions of your life, because I'm telling you, it gets worse. I drove to Daniel's house that night, told him everything. He held me while I cried and said we should just leave now, tonight, pack a bag and drive west and never look back. "What about Lisa?" I asked. "What about Christmas? What about the rest of your life?" he said. I almost did it. I almost walked away from everything. But then my phone rang and it was Lisa, excited about coming home, asking if I'd make my famous apple pie because she'd been craving it. I listened to my daughter's voice and I realized I couldn't do it. Not like that. Not without telling her, not without trying to explain. I told Daniel I needed more time. He said time was the one thing we didn't have, that Richard would make decisions for me if I didn't make them myself. He was right. Lisa arrived with her family 3 days later. She hugged me tight and whispered, "You look so good, Mom. Seriously, you're glowing." I wanted to die right there. Richard played the perfect host. Smiling, engaged, doting grandfather. I watched him with the kids and saw glimpses of the man I'd married 42 years ago. And I felt the guilt crash over me so hard I could barely stand. On Christmas Eve, while everyone was decorating cookies in the kitchen, Richard asked me to come upstairs. We stood in his bedroom, the one he'd slept in alone for 15 years, and he closed the door. "I talked to a lawyer," he said quietly. "Filed papers yesterday. They'll be served after New Year's." My legs nearly gave out. "Richard, I'm not doing this to hurt you, Margaret. I'm doing it because I deserve more than this, even at 73. Even now." His voice cracked. "I deserve more than a wife who wishes she was somewhere else." He was right. God help me. He was right. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "I know you are," he said, "but sorry doesn't change anything." Lisa found me crying in the bathroom 20 minutes later. She held me and asked what was wrong, and I couldn't tell her. Couldn't say the words. So I lied and said I was just emotional about Christmas. But she knew something was broken. I could see it in her eyes. Here's where everything falls apart. If you've made it this far, don't leave now. Daniel called on Christmas night. I snuck out to the driveway to answer. He said he couldn't do this anymore. The waiting, the uncertainty. That if I wasn't going to choose him, he needed to know now so he could start trying to move on. "I love you," I told him, "but I don't know how to blow up my family." "You already did," he said. "You just haven't admitted it yet." He was right again. Everyone was right except me. I went back inside. Lisa and her husband and the kids were watching a movie. Richard was in his chair, pretending to watch with them. I stood in the doorway of that living room, and I realized I didn't belong there anymore. I'd already left in every way that mattered. On December 28th, Lisa came to me while Richard was out getting groceries. She sat me down and said, "Mom, what's going on? Dad won't talk to me. You're barely holding it together. What happened?" So I told her. Everything. I watched my daughter's face change as I spoke, watched her go from concerned to confused to shocked to something that looked like betrayal. When I finished, she sat there in silence for what felt like an hour. Finally, she said, "How could you do this to him?" Not, "Are you okay?" Not, "What do you need?" Just, "How could you?" And I didn't have a good answer. I still don't. Lisa left the next morning with her family. Barely said goodbye. Hasn't returned my calls since. Richard moved into a hotel on New Year's Day. The divorce papers arrived on January 3rd. I'm sitting in this empty house now, recording this, and I don't know if I made the right choice or if I destroyed everything for nothing. Because here's the part I haven't told you yet, the part that keeps me up at night. 2 weeks ago, I found out Daniel's been talking to Sarah's sister, meeting her for coffee, taking her to the same places he took me. When I confronted him, he said I'd pushed him away, that I'd chosen my family over us, that he needed someone who could actually be there. So now I'm alone. Richard won't speak to me. Lisa screens my calls. And the man I thought I'd spend the rest of my life with is already moving on. I gave up everything, and I'm not even sure what it was for anymore. I'm 66 years old, and I have to rebuild my entire life from nothing. I have to figure out who Margaret is when she's not someone's wife or someone's mother or someone's secret. Maybe I'm the villain in this story. Maybe I deserve everything that's happened. Or maybe I'm just a woman who was suffocating and grabbed at the first breath of air she could find, even if it meant drowning everyone else around her. I don't know anymore. So I need you to tell me. Leave a comment below. Was I wrong? Was there ever a right answer? What would you have done? Because I'm still here, trying to figure out how to live with what I've done, and I'm terrified that the answer is, I can't. Hit subscribe if you want to follow what happens next, because this story isn't over. I just don't know yet if there's any way for it to end that doesn't destroy me completely.